So, evaluating new right family theory. One of the things that we must recognize is that new right family theory has been a major influence on what's called family ideology or familial ideology that has dominated popular culture and common sense thinking in the media about how families and their members should behave. Okay, now new right ideas about family ideology have been criticized as well as supported, but we've got to recognize that a lot of what you will hear people talk about in terms of common sense is effectively new right theory on the family. So we're going to look at some of that now. So one of the new rights allegations about social policies is that social policies that the government have enacted over the years have damaged the nuclear family. So is this the case? So we've heard about some of the arguments the new right have put forward. So let's look at whether others agree. So some sociologists like Abbott and Wallace, who are feminist sociologists, and Fox Harding have argued that state social policies haven't undermined the nuclear family in the way that the new right have argued. Okay. Instead, they've argued that social policies have actually supported traditional marriage and the nuclear family. There have been tax and welfare policies that have favoured heterosexual married couples rather than cohabitees, unmarried couples, single parents or same-sex couples. So, for example, if you're looking at social policies on inheritance, you'll find that inheritance between married partners is automatic and free. There's no inheritance tax to pay if one partner dies. However, if you're not married, then there is. Okay, so there's an advantage in being married there. Pension inheritance rights is another thing. So if you are the married spouse of someone who dies, you will inherit part of their pension, whereas it's not automatic and free if you're not married. Okay, it's not impossible, but it's much more difficult. So there are incentives that favour being married. Okay, now you could argue that there could be more. All right, the new right definitely would, but it's not true to say that all social policy has been against being married and being a part of a nuclear family. It's also true to say that government ministers frequently make reference to nuclear families as the best possible type of family to bring children up in if you can, and that marriage is preferable, being more stable and permanent in the eyes of the people who promote it, preferable to cohabitation, which is sometimes seen as more transient. It's like, if you're not going to get married, then is that a sign that you're not going to stick around? You could counter-evaluate this by saying, well, divorce and separation statistics show that, you know, people get married, but they don't necessarily stay married. So it's not a guarantee of being stable and permanent in terms of family. You could also mention the dark side of the family that might be more prevalent when a heavily dysfunctional family is unable to separate. So if people aren't getting on, forcing them to stay together or discouraging them from separation might create problems within the household. And you could also look at the interactionist view that it's about the quality of love and nurturing provided by the parents, not necessarily whether you're married or not. Okay, so you can be married and be a rubbish parent, and you can be unmarried and be a brilliant parent. And so therefore, it's not necessarily the state of being married that matters that much. You could also look at social policies regarding child benefit. Child benefit gets paid to the mother, and the government's reluctance to totally fund free universal nursery care in conjunction with continuing to pay child benefit to the mother have helped to reinforce the idea that it should be women who stay at home and take responsibility for the care and nurturing of children. You could argue that if the government really wanted to push women out into the workplace, they would totally fund free universal nursery care and free women up, but they haven't. You could also look at how some unmarried fathers are denied family rights with and over their children. So there's things like Fathers for Justice, which was set up as a pressure group designed to try and get familial rights for fathers. And so in conjunction with sort of the idea of, women being the main carers, you can evaluate it by saying it's not always conducive to a happy family relationship, even if the family is separated and not living under the same roof. If things like fathers are not able to get access to their own children. This moves on to this point on the Child Support Agency, which reinforces the idea that fathers should be financially responsible as instrumental providers for their children. Okay, so the idea is you pay, if you've had children, you're responsible financially for them. It does this by legally enforcing the payment of maintenance by the father to the mother of the child. It's normally that way round, because the majority of separations and divorces involve the court awarding custody and therefore expense of bringing up the children to the mother. And I've got a link there to a British social attitudes survey on what people think about child support agency and child support in general. And it tends to be that people in this country, the vast majority feel that both parents should be financially responsible for their own children. It shouldn't be the state. You can also look at state social policy for maternity rights as promoting the idea that women look after their children and they're the ones who should be responsible. Because when you look at it, women get 39 weeks paid leave for maternity and men only get 2 weeks. That will change, and it is in the process of review. And they're looking to make it a more equitable sort of parental leave that can be divided up. Some companies will already, so a lot of companies have moved ahead of the law and been more progressive, and they operate that system. But legally, this is the minimum that you're entitled to, no matter where you work. So it's not yet universally the case that you get more than this. Okay, although some companies will give you more as an option. And we can also look at some of the provision of housing in the UK. And most council houses and the majority of private houses are built with the nuclear family in mind. When house builders are looking at who they're going to sell to, they construct houses that meet the needs and the size needs of the nuclear family. Okay, they do make some bungalows for old people and flats for young professionals who are not married yet. The majority of house builds are catering for a nuclear family. So you can argue that the structure and fabric of society are promoting and supporting the idea of the nuclear family. So then there's this other side of things. We talked about how the new right have been very influential in how, what people think is just common sense about how a family should be. Okay, and we call this, the sociological phrase is family ideology or familial ideology. And what it is it's a set of ideas, an ideology, made up of how family life should be organised and what people should do, what their roles are. And what we find is that the new rights ideas on family dominate the public and media debates about the best way to be a family, to organise family life. So a lot of these ideas you'll find familiar. Example, the nuclear family is the most stable family type is a new right idea. That single parents are a problem type of family, okay, that's a new right idea. That divorce is too easy to obtain is a new right idea. That women should stay at home and look after their children. So a lot of those are new right ideas about family life that are, a lot of them are continuations of a functionalist, traditionalist perspective on the family. Now, it's not the only way to look at it, but you'll find that's a big dominant chunk of how the majority of people in the UK think about families. But of course, there are challenges and criticisms to that. So familial ideology has come under a lot of criticism from feminist sociologists who argue that there are problematic aspects to it. So for example, feminist sociologists have argued that familial ideology, as we've just seen from the new right, is problematical because it's basically patriarchal in nature. All the power and agency are given to men. Men are allowed to go out and work, men are allowed to go out into society, but women are restricted to the home and they're supposed to stay at home and do everything at home, and so they don't have that same power and agency. Feminist sociologists also argue that familial ideology is problematical because it over-idealizes the nuclear family. It's too good to be true. And this takes us away from the reality that there is the dark side of the family. There are problems caused by divorce. There's domestic violence, there's domestic abuse, there's poverty, etc. They also argue that it's problematic in how it portrays divorce in a negative way. So the new right will always talk about divorce creating problems and highlighting the negative effects of divorce. And of course, this ignores the fact that sometimes divorce is what's needed or what's best in order to solve the problem in a situation. So if you denied that, if you denied divorce, you might be forcing dysfunctional or abusive relationships to continue. And so therefore, it's a bit of a one-sided look at divorce if you're saying it's always a negative. Feminist sociologists also argue that familial ideology from the new right is problematical because it's led to the idea that family is a private institution that requires little or no intervention from the state. That might sound reasonable, but the problem in action is that this idea has meant that some things like domestic abuse and child abuse have been ignored by the state because they occur inside the family. So as an example, until the 1990s, when the Home Office issued an instruction that police were to intervene in cases of domestic abuse and domestic violence, if your neighbor rang the police and said, I can hear a terrible fight going on next door, I think they're killing each other, the police would turn up to investigate. But the moment that they saw that it was a husband and wife having a fight inside their own house, they wouldn't intervene most of the time. They'd say, oh, this is a domestic abuse, this is a domestic dispute, it's a private matter, and they wouldn't get involved. That only changed in the last few decades. We can see the problems with that from both sides. You could argue that it's bad that the state interfere in people's private lives. Equally, you could argue that it's very welcome that the state interfere in people's private lives if it stops someone from being injured, abused, or killed. Okay, so there are different opinions about this familial ideology about the family being a private institution. Feminist sociologists have also criticize familial ideology because it dismisses other family types as being deviant, wrong, or broken. It suggests that these family types are the cause of a large number of social problems in society. The idea that if you from a divorced family, that somehow this is going to cause maladjusted children, failure of socialization, etc., etc. Grace, thank you for that. It was fine for the husband to kill the wife because they were married. Well, I think at that point a crime would have been committed, Grace, and so the police would intervene. But if people were having an argument and throwing things at each other and there were bruises and no one was being killed, the police would just sort of say, well, let them sort it out. So what the police wouldn't do was say, if you don't stop this, we're going to stay until you calm down, or we're going to stop this, and and effectively they would turn a blind eye to it, and it led to all sorts of abuses. But if the husband did kill his wife, for example, or the wife killed the husband, the police would then get involved because a crime had been committed. But the actual fighting between the husband and wife wasn't treated with the same legal weighting as if they'd been out on the street fighting. If they were doing it inside their house, then people said, oh, the police would say, oh, that's a private matter. So back to the one on the screen. Feminists, among other sociologists, argue that it's not true that the only problem children or problems in society come from certain family types. There's a lot of evidence that says that other family types can raise children just as well as the nuclear family. And also there's evidence that the nuclear family is not immune from raising children that cause social problems. So as a task, you could try and explain the term familial ideology, okay, which is, in case you've forgotten, it's this tranche of common sense ideas that we have in our culture about how we think a family should be, and it's mainly based on functionalist tradition and new right ideology.